Welcome to the Takshashila and this institution and the Niskanen Center special joint briefing on free markets. What does economic prosperity look like in a post-pandemic world? I'm Kodiak Davis, Director of Government Affairs at Niskanen, and it is my pleasure to be moderating today's discussion. A quick reminder to all our participants, there's a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentations, and our panelists will answer them at the end. The Takshashila Institution is a center for research and education in public policy. Located in Bangalore, India, the institution has been operating around the world since 2010 over the internet. As an independent, nonpartisan policy research think tank, they are engaged with India's relationship with the world, transforming how India is governed, and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. The Niskanen Center was founded in 2015 as a nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C. Our policy work focuses on market-based solutions and the promotion of an open society to address the challenges of today. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists for our discussion today. Steve Teles of Niskanen and Anupam Manur of the Takshashila Institution. Steve is a senior fellow and a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. He is recently the co-author of The Captured Economy, which investigates rent-seeking and the growth of inequality. Anupam is an assistant professor at the institution where he focuses on the intersection of economics, technology, and public policy. He is currently working on platform economics, India's job crisis, the New World Order, and economic solutions for a post-pandemic India. Today's discussion focuses on the free market and prosperity in a post-pandemic world. Steve will begin by providing an overview of markets and inequality and what mechanisms can prevent skewed outcomes. And then Anupam will pick up at the intersections of markets and trade and how trade can help regulate market inefficiencies. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Steve to get us started.
Thank you, Kodiak. Whenever anyone says I welcome our esteemed invitees, I'm always looking around, seeing if there's somebody else on the call. So, hi, I'm Steve Teles. I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins, senior fellow at Niskanen. Most recently, I'm the author of this book, Never Trump, on conservative opposition to Donald Trump. But right now, I'm going to be talking about this book, The Captured Economy, which I wrote with Niskanen Vice President Brink Lindsay, and I think this book is very on target for the conversation today because the questions about inequality and the role that markets play in inequality are, if anything, even more pressing in this era, right? We are being faced quite severely with the consequences of hyper inequality in terms of the actual, who's actually getting COVID-19. People like me have the ability to hide out in our houses with relatively secure incomes, while other people who have to be the ones to serve us food and get us groceries and deliver the mail don't have the ability to do so. And so in that way, the questions of inequality have only been heightened by the current crisis. But even now, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what are the actual causes of inequality. And obviously, these vary significantly across countries. But certainly in the United States, there's a few that have been out there and are worth starting out with to sort of frame our conversation. Lots of economists have focused on increasing returns on skill driven by the increasing scope of the market, right? And so this argument says that as the scope of markets increases, those who are the winners get higher returns. And that in general, as we've been mechanizing and automating stuff, those sort of raw skills that are being replaced are less valuable. And the implication of that is more education, more or better designed. but somewhere in increasing skills makes sense if there's a high skill premium. The second argument, which you get more from the left, looks at the declining power of labor, right? And says that basically inequality is a function of the relative power of capital and labor. And if you want to increase the labor share, you have to increase the organization of labor, which means more unions. Third, especially on the right in the United States, and you've seen this from people like Charles Murray, you get a kind of bifurcation of culture explanation. And this explanation says that the kind of cultural patterns that lead to affluence are being more and more concentrated at the top while they're deteriorating at the bottom. And that explanation sort of leads you to some sort of theory of moral uplift. Finally, in people like Thomas Piketty, you get the idea that this is really capitalism's iron law, right? That capitalism just is a inherently upward redistributing system that increasingly concentrates wealth in particular at the top as it sort of trickles down across generations. But interestingly, both the left and the right have a version of the inevitability of inequality in markets, right? There are people on the right who say that that markets inevitably produce high levels of inequality, but the outcomes of markets are so awesome that it's worth just sucking it up. And so in a way, that's the mirror image of what Piketty's saying, which is Piketty saying it's inevitable, but it's bad, and people on the right say it's inevitable, but it's good. But almost all of these treat inequality as a natural feature of a capitalist economy. And up to a point, it is. But at least in the United States, let's note some interesting facts. When you look at the very top earners, there's a massive disproportion of individuals in fields characterized by industry-specific regulation and market structure. And so when we talk about regulation, it's going to be really important for us to be precise about what we're talking about. I'm not talking about environmental, anti-discrimination, financial stability kind of regulation. We're talking about industry-specific regulation and market structure. And so when you look at some of the industries that are generating inequality at the most extreme level in the United States, you actually see that almost all of them are characterized by these forms of industry-specific regulation. In finance, you have government encouragement of securitization, subsidy of retirement savings, implicit guarantees, low capital requirements, right? All these end up serving the interests of increasing the returns and protecting those in finance from the consequences of bad decision making. In intellectual property, patent, copyright, all these have increased enormously in the United States and have actually been embedded in trade deals with countries like India and other countries. So in some sense, we've been exporting our patent and copyright regime abroad, and that largely serves to substantially increase the incomes of people who have intellectual property. The most obvious example would be entertainment, where you know, it's one thing to get a 5-year copyright or a 10-year copyright, but as someone like Disney, right, which now has 70, 75-year copyrights, right, that simply magnifies their returns. But you go further down the 1% when you get to the sturdy yeoman of the 1%, when you look at doctors, lawyers, dentists, optometrists, other licensed professions, and pervasively regulated fields like real estate development and car dealers, right? Those are all industries that have some substantial barrier to entry for competition. And even when you get to the housing market, right? In the United States, it's very hard to build new housing, which means that people who are already insiders in the housing market are protected against the risk that there's going to be new supply on the market, and that ends up dramatically increasing the value of their wealth. The paradox of at least the United States, but I think this is true about some other advanced industrial countries, is that in a supposedly deregulatory era, these fields have all gotten more regulated. Subsidy, constraints on market entry, and constraints on competition. And this matters for inequality because in general, markets should actually have a very powerful mechanism for dealing with inequality generated by hypernormal profits, and that's competition, right? Hypernormal profits should send a signal to other market participants that the water is warm, you should go in here, right? Because there's all these extra profits to be had. But that mechanism gets broken down when you have regulatory constraints on entry. When it's hard to actually go and start up a new industry, a new firm to compete against the insiders, and that's the natural tendency of insiders, right? Insiders are almost always going to try to redistribute their profits, to recycle their profits, not necessarily just into becoming more competitive, to doing more R&D, but actually investing it in the political system to protect themselves from competition. And that ends up breaking down one of the important antibodies that a market system has against inequality. And so if we start thinking about how we might deal with the problem of inequality in a market economy, obviously things like redistribution are very important. At the Niskanen Center, we have a very large program on social insurance, and I think that's very important. But one thing to say is that this pre-distribution, right, the actual distribution of market incomes as a result of how we design markets is putting more and more and more pressure on our systems of redistribution, right? Those systems of redistribution are having to work faster and faster to make up for the inequality that's being generated by the policy that government is creating on the other hand. And that's where the argument we've had in the Niskanen Center and our Captured Economy program, every time I say that, I have to put the book up. The argument we have is that improved systems of social insurance on the one hand and deregulation of these particular forms of incumbent protecting market systems are two great tastes that taste great together. That they might, again, in our older ideological frame, those may seem in tension, but actually a system of social insurance and a system that, that removes regulatory protections from incumbents actually push in the same direction of both more competition, more innovation, and less inequality generated by very long-term sustained hypernormal profits. And that's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I'll turn it over to you now, Anupam.
Thanks a lot for that, Steve. So the way I thought I would structure, and this is going to be probably like one of those complicated Christopher Nolan movies where we go, you know, in the past, present, and future, also again traverse between domestically and internationally. And the reason why we have to do that is when it comes down to trade, I think all of this is interconnected. And while of course we are seeing now that increasingly we are listening to words such as self-sufficiency, self-reliance, we are listening to words such as protectionism, strategic production, decoupling from the world, and so on. This is extremely bad news for a developing country such as India. And of course, for a lot of the countries, in fact, it's bad news for the US, it's bad news for China, it's bad news for pretty much, according to me, every other country. And I'll come down to how trade is going to be impacted. But I just want to first start with an argument that this protectionist tendencies is not particularly new, and it's not entirely caused by the coronavirus. If you just, again, so this is where we do flashbacks. If you just go back in time to 2016, of course, where the monumental year in the US, that's when things started changing, and we started looking at increasing protectionist tendencies. We looked at, of course, an open trade war that existed. The US put a whole bunch of tariff measures on, sometimes in open defiance of the World Trade Organization, on on China, on steel, on aluminum, and on many other products coming from Mexico, from the EU. And of course, there was retaliation from these countries, and increasingly there was a trade war that was blooming. Of course, the US interest got hurt in all of this. So did of all the other countries that was involved. India got sucked into this entire trade war, whether willingly or sometimes unwillingly. So we got, for example, India got ousted from the RCEP, or sorry, the generalized system of preferences that you had. And so, that whole bunch of measures tells you that the world itself was going towards a slightly more protectionist stance since about 2016-17. India by itself is an equal culprit in all of this. We've in many instances, if you look at the statistics, I think the average average effective tariff rate of India is probably one of the highest among all of our trading partners, the big global trading partners. In fact, if you could look at another statistic, which is to say the number of anti-dumping duties or safeguard duties that has been imposed by any country, again, India ranks second, of course, after the US. But if you normalize it for volume of trade, I think India would be the highest. You could look at the number of tariffs we put on electronic items. We put tariffs on washing machines and fridges. We've actually limited the amount of FDI in certain places, that is foreign direct investment. We have done a whole bunch of measures since 2000, again, about the same time, 2017-18. And, I think many of you might be aware, especially we've limited the way that the Amazon and Walmart could actually operate in India in terms of their inventory model. So we basically didn't allow US companies such as Walmart and Amazon to hold inventory while acting as a platform. So all of these, I think, led to, and we put tariffs on dairy products coming from the US because, and if you understand the logic, it was that US cows are not vegetarian, if you believe it. So, just to give you an idea of the kind of trade battles that exist between India and the rest of the world. So this resulted, of course, in this thorny issue of the generalized system of preferences. We're going back and forth on this. All of this is to set the context that the world was going towards this protectionist stance. Now, what does that actually mean? Let's look at India's position, and I think you could just about generalize it and extrapolate the same kind of reasoning for many other countries in a similar position, which are developing countries. It could be applicable to Brazil. It could be applicable to many even Eastern European economies. It could be applicable to lots of other developing countries in Asia and Africa as well. If you look at, go back to fundamentals, Econ 101, and take the basic macroeconomic fundamental identity, which is GDP, or Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. And I'm sorry, I don't want to get into equations at the moment and probably drive away all of our listeners. But if you look at main components of GDP, which is consumption, investment, government expenditure, and export growth. Where did India start before the pandemic? Again, so let's go before the pandemic. India's GDP growth was failing. It was falling rather. It was at 4.5%, and for a emerging economies such as India, which is used to the heady days of 9% and 10% growth in the 2000s, 4.5% is a drastic fall. I mean, it's equivalent, according to me, as a massive slowdown in the US. And so if you look at a 4.5% GDP growth for India, and you couple that with a nearly 10 percentage point drop in investment rate, and an equivalent drop in the savings rate in India over a decade, probably. You also look at falling exports. And all of that combined tells you that India didn't enter into the pandemic in a very healthy state. And therefore, exports or trade becomes extremely important. So if you have consumption, which cannot, especially post-pandemic, I don't think consumption can lift the economy of India, right? It cannot be the sustaining factor, as it has been for many years. I mean, nearly 60% of India's GDP is consumption, but now with a lot of jobs lost, with incomes falling, with a lot of uncertainty, I don't think consumption is going to be that bright star which is going to spark Indian this thing. And the same might be true of the US as well. I don't think consumption can, fuel the US economic growth as much as it did before the pandemic. And therefore, I think is the tendency to go inward looking and to protect your industries and so on. Look at investment. Again, for investment to thrive, what do you need? You need an open economy. You need to assure your investors that you're going to protect their investment. You need property rights. You need a stable policy environment. You need to make sure that you can, those who invest in India, they must have the assurance that they can use that investment to make profits. Ultimately, that's where the game is, and that's where the markets work. So in order to do that, I think one of the key essential points is to have a free and flowing trade system. The protectionism is just not the answer in all of this, but it's to do more with how do you have an open trading system such that you can draw in investment from the rest of the country, from the rest of the world. That's about investment. Government expenditure, I think, is already to its limit. Fiscal deficit in India was already exceeding the limits that were set by the government itself. And therefore, I think we've reached, especially post-pandemic and the big fiscal stimulus that we've already announced, we can debate about the merits of that announcement. But, by and large, we've announced a big fiscal stimulus, and there isn't a lot of space for all of this. So that brings down to, again, the only kind of answer, the big answer rather, for the solution for post-pandemic India is somehow lies in this trade aspect as well. Let's look at how India has been faring in trade, again, before pandemic, and then therefore it gives us an idea of what we need to do going forward. India's share of global trade is disproportionately low. Compared to just its size of its economy. If you look at just one aspect, which is, let's say, merchandise exports, India contributes 1.7% to global merchandise export, right? And I think that is extremely low for a country of its size, for a population of our size, and of course an economy of our size. Compare that with China, and I think that's well above 14% for China. Of course, and it's probably not a very realistic comparison with China, but you can compare with any other similar kind of country at a similar stage of development, and I still think India is probably lower than what it should be, and where the potential lies at least. And that's the important aspect. That my main argument is that there's a lot of potential in trade. If you're talking about prosperity and the possible kind of roots and sources of prosperity going forward, and I think trade is one of the big aspects of it. We've often said that we want to be part of global value chains. And of course, that is going to be an extremely important thing. We don't know how it's going to be broken going forward. I think a lot of value chains are broken, and therefore it's going to get tougher for us to be part of some of these things. But one way to ensure that we can, if not just be part of the global value chain, but become a significant contributor and even the trigger for global value chains is by having an open regime. If the rest of the world is going to start closing its doors and supply chains are broken, India can be that one of the shining beacons in the developing world. We're saying our doors are open. Why don't you come here, manufacture, and then export to the rest of the world? And I think that is a unique opportunity that exists, especially given that a lot of the companies, and we've seen this, a lot of the companies are actually, probably hedging their investments out of China. So, I don't think everyone, to be realistic, I don't think a lot of companies will just move out of China, because China itself will provide a huge market for many countries, but there will still be enough number of countries which will want to hedge. So if they're moving out and they're looking for options and alternatives, I think one way that India can signal that it is an interesting and an important destination that's to be considered by these companies is by opening up your trade. And therefore, you're signaling to the world that we're open for trade, we are serious, and we'll protect your investments and we'll help you. We'll help you grow. But for us, I think, for a country that is India, you not only get employment generation, which we've already had a massive crisis of unemployment in India, and I think it's worsened and aggravated and exacerbated because of the pandemic. But it's going to, that's one way to increase employment generation. But equally, also again, employment growth. You're going to have incomes growth, we're going to have higher consumption and higher export. So all of that will help. So if you want to be part of, as of now, as I said, India's contribution to global value chains for most products is extremely low. If you look at mobile phones, it's hardly 0.04%. For computers, it's about, again, in negligible. Most of the things that we see and we use on a daily basis, electronic items, for example, India is less than 1% in terms of its contribution to value chains. I think there's a huge potential here for going from that less than 1% to even, let's say, 5% in the next 5 years. And that can have, very significant returns in not just in terms of, purely those numbers and statistics, but in a very realistic manner of how people are going to get helped in terms of employment and income. And going forward, I think that's going to be increasingly important. I want to just take one step further and say that a lot of the time, I think when people argue for free trade, it's normally to do with how trade can help exports, and definitely it can. I mean, we know, for example, that, or if you take one particular industry in India, which is auto components. Auto components in India has been one of the rare success stories, and it's exported a lot to the world, and that has happened largely because you've had an opening up of trade there. So there were not many restrictions on auto components, and there were no huge import duties, there were no licensing requirements, etc. And by and large, the government ignored that aspect. And therefore, I think that particular industry thrived in India. And that for me is always, one of the prime cases for showing why trade is important and why free trade can help. And it's not just about, again, a sector growing or an industry growing, but if you look at the number of jobs it's created, the number of value chains it's created within the country, and how it has helped in turn the entire automobile industry. And by the way, the auto components are not these big, big multinational corporations like Suzuki and Honda and so on. These are really small, your MSMEs, which hire between 100 and 200 people who, basically are located near one of these big factories and which supply to them, right? So you're creating employment in the rural regions in India or the tier 2 towns in India and so on. So that, I think, is the real success story. So we understand how that works, how, liberalizing imports can also have a massive influence and importance in helping exports, and therefore that can help in creating employment and income. But the other really big important reason, thing to discuss is about imports by itself and for the sake of imports. And let's again remember that a lot of India's GDP is again through consumption. And if you're a consumer-led economy with let's say a lot of important goods also coming from outside of the country, by having a liberal regime, I think consumers benefit. And if a huge population, which is, let's say, which has got, let's say, mediocre income and not extremely high incomes, if they are benefited from cheaper imports, I think that should be a policy goal and an end in and of itself. And this has happened. Again, you can take the example of the mobile phone, and I see that I'm probably spoken too much already, so I'm going to cut short soon. But if you take the case of the mobile phone, just the fact that we've had imports freely coming from, we've put in restrictions, but by and large, it's still coming. And you can see the kind of real impact it's had on the Indian economy. The fact that a person with extremely low income still has a mobile phone, who's able to access entertainment, who's able to do business, who's able to pay a small shopkeeper in India is now able to get digital payments during the pandemic because of the mobile revolution. And that, for us, I think we should never lose track or focus of things like that. If there are things that can purely help our consumers, there should be a policy goal in and of itself. So I think I'll, by and large, probably end here, and then we can open it up for discussion, or I can take a few other topics later. But I just want to end with one probably a statistic. It might be one data point, but I'm sure there's a lot of literature and a lot of evidence which can corroborate this. But if you look at history, Indian growth history, I think the best periods of growth for us was at a time when the world was liberalized and when India was also open to trade. And if you look at this period between 2001 and 2007, when the global trade was at its highest, and where of course US interest rates were at 1%, which helped in liquidity, which FDI came into India, and portfolio investment as well was flowing into India. And India by itself was doing reforms and trying to, the first half at least, before the financial crisis. This was the best periods of growth for India. These were periods where we had 9% growth for at least 3 or 4 years consecutively, and our inflation was low. GDP growth was high, fiscal deficit. In fact, that was probably there were 2 years in between where we experienced trade surplus for the first time in probably 30 years, both on either side, right? So it just tells you that is the best period. You can look at China's growth from 1978 onwards and how it has grown. And again, that has coincided with the period where the world was liberal, where trade was liberal, and where there was, free movement of labor, free movement of capital, free movement of goods and services. So just, I want to insist on that. And so therefore, going forward, I think it's purely in India's interest. Of course, it's in the interest of the US and pretty much every other country. But what is often misunderstood is that free trade is not in the interest of developing countries. So while I think everyone inherently understood, and I'm deliberately using the past tense, understood that free trade is good for developed countries. Now that is, in question mark in the political circles in the US. But, it was always questioned whether free trade and generally open markets is good for India or developing countries such as India. And I want to emphasize that it is, it will continue to be, and therefore it is in India's interest to, for example, safeguard this particular system of open trade, safeguard WTO. I mean, that I thought it's rare that an Indian would say this, but WTO is increasingly important. It's losing importance, but I think we should make sure that the WTO rules and that system prevails. You can call it WTO or you can call it something else, but a system of trade where everyone agrees upon the rules, I think is important. Yeah, I'll probably stop there, Kodiak. I exceeded my time.
Well, thank you so much to both of our panelists for this thoughtful exploration of market efficiencies and inequality and how trade can really be a mechanism for decreasing inequality. So we have some questions rolling in, but one of the benefits of being the moderator is that I can slip a question of my own in and cut the line. So I would like to pose to both Steve and Anupam the question, which is, and I think it dovetails nicely into your last remarks. So it sounds like the world is has been trending or is still trending towards more protectionist trade policy. Do you think the pandemic will force us further apart and kind of double down on this protectionist stance? Or do you think that the pandemic creates an opportunity to reevaluate some of those policies and actually trend more towards free trade?
So again, Anupam's more of the authority on trade than I am. All I'll say is the politics of the United States certainly are pushing in the direction of protectionism. In part, even for me, I'm a sort of old unilateral free trader. I'd be dumping all of my own restrictions right now. That was always my position. I do think that the combination of the vulnerability that's been demonstrated in our supply chains, on the one hand, and the inevitable and increasing geopolitical conflict with China, that I don't think there's any. I think that's a 20-year, 30-year phenomenon, right? Those are just deep structural features that are going to make it harder to really have an open trade regime. On the other hand, and this is the point I wanted to get in there earlier on the COVID connection, because we all have to connect everything up to COVID now. I do think that one thing that the crisis has done is it has exposed a lot of the internal protectionism. Again, as when we talk about protectionism, we always have to keep in mind that there's internal and external protectionism, all right? And so one consequence could be that we have more external protectionism. Now, again, one problem, and Anupam sort of gestured at this, is external protectionism facilitates internal protectionism, right? Because external trade, it can actually be a a form of competition against internal cartels or other anti-competitive relationships, right? And so if we have a decreasing international trade, we should actually expect to see higher supernormal profits by firms that are protected by internal competition restrictions. So on the other hand, there has been a bunch of those sort of internal cartel relationships have been put under pressure. In the United States, you can think about schools, right? Suddenly, all kind of people who, like me, who are sitting at home trying to get my kid to, to do some sort of virtual learning experience, right, have been paying closer attention to what's going on in their schools and are suddenly thinking, I wonder how great we think those things are doing, which are run disproportionately by the labor force of the schools, right? We've seen in lots of areas of health where COVID-19 has created significant pressure on protectionist regimes. One of the first things that happened when New York was freaking out about its healthcare capacity is we got rid of a lot of restrictions on doctors and nurses licensed in other states, right? That's a very important protectionist regulatory regime. So I do think that this is going to be a weird combination of almost inevitable and irrepressible pressures for protectionism, which again, I think some of those have, genuine national security justifications for. But the real thing is to keep that from spreading to lots of areas where it doesn't, right? The fact that we want to reduce how intertwined we are with China doesn't mean that we shouldn't be intertwined with India. I think that's a separate kind of question. But the thing I would try and keep in everyone's mind is simply this intersection between external trade and internal protectionism.
Yeah. I'll just quickly just add my 2 bits here. What I would probably like to say is that post-COVID, I think there have been a lot of really genuine concerns to this kind of free trade. Of course, China is a big geopolitical issue, and currently with India, I think a lot of people know that the border skirmish and so on, it becomes increasingly difficult to ever justify arguments for free trade with China. So that is understood, and even it's very easily understandable. But there's no reason why countries such as India and the US and Australia and Japan and many other countries and parts of EU can actually get together now and form this kind of trade agreement. So you can call it under any name. We had the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which kind of fell through. But there are, I think, increasingly, it should become increasingly obvious that countries of like-mindedness at least should get together and have some form of free trade agreement. And this is surely going to be in India's interest. For example, I think just not being part of that TPP when the arguments were going, discussions were happening before, India would lose out as much as $50 billion each year just by not being part of these regional agreements, and that's quite a big amount of money. So similarly, I think right now, even for the US, it makes sense for the US, it makes sense for Europe to have even selective trade agreements. While I understand the need to have the strategic production where you shouldn't have. Of course, we saw situations where even your PPEs and ventilators, etc., were produced in China, and therefore that led to a lot of problems. So I understand the need for strategic production of a few items, but by and large, for pens and pencils and mobile phones and water bottles, I don't think we should get into the strategic argument of geopolitical reasons. I think there we should, and therefore it requires deliberate positioning from leading countries such as the US and India to argue for a trade regime which is mutually beneficial. And I'll just probably stop at that. It's going to be a quick answer. But the internal protectionism that Steve was talking about, that is also an extremely interesting thing, what's happening in India. So obviously, I didn't have, probably enough time to go into what's happening domestically in terms of free markets in India. But there's a very interesting contrasting and conflicting response from Indian state within India and outside India. So while, as I said, we've been largely protectionist outside, internally I'm beginning to see a few rays of hope, if you don't mind me just elaborating on those. We've seen states take the lead in dismantling some of the most repressive regulations that we had, which was stopping businesses from prospering and from doing well. So, for example, and I don't want to get too much into it because it might not be relevant for all of our audience, but in terms of land laws and labor laws, these were very, very sticky set of laws which have not been changed since 1991, and now you're seeing that states are taking up the initiative in reforming some of these things. Similarly, for example, we liberalized some parts of FDI. We liberalized some parts of, or in the agricultural sector, which was always had a tight noose around its neck in terms of government regulations. We're finally seeing some kind of, movement towards freer markets. So there's an internal understanding that free markets are important for prosperity, and I'm extremely glad to see that. But it's not, equally reflecting in all aspects of our policy making. So while we do all of these rays of hope, at the same time we go ahead and put price caps on COVID testing. We put price caps on something else, on masks and hand sanitizers. We put an export ban. So there's this conflicting tension that exists in policy making within India.
Well, thank you both for that thorough answer. And I'm once again reminded what a pleasure it is to get to work with such brilliant minds. And I'm also really grateful that I am not going to be responsible for answering some of the top-notch questions that we're getting. I'm going to turn those right over to you. So our first question, I think this is an excellent question, is what does economic prosperity look like in a post-pandemic world? Isn't the title of this briefing a little optimistic? And I have to say, I myself am a relentless optimist. It's how I get out of bed every day.
Yeah, this question is by a good friend of mine called Amol, I'm sure. So yeah, I think it is optimistic for sure. We don't know, there's a lot of uncertainties for sure. We don't know when the pandemic will end. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave. We've barely seen the end of the first wave. And probably the definition of prosperity will change by itself. But I think there are times such as this. I think we should always set goals for ourselves in terms of what we should try to achieve, and therefore consistently work towards achieving those goals. And only then will you be in the mind space of working towards those goals. I think that's a very short answer for this question from me.
Steve, do you have anything to add?
Oh yeah, so I like Kodiak have an irrational level of optimism that is being tested in current days. Again, going back to my point about certain kinds of protectionist regimes coming under pressure, one thing we've seen is some quite rickety parts, at least of the United States economy, going through years and years of change in a few months, right? In some parts of healthcare, right? That is, the speed at which we're developing both therapeutics and a vaccine has required enormous change in our regulatory regimes. Right now, there's a question of how much they're going to snap back to their previous performance. But it may be that having gone through this for COVID, we're going to be rethinking the speed at which all those regulatory regimes operate going forward. Again, as we talked about before, with the labor force in healthcare, right? In the United States, healthcare is approaching a fifth of the economy. So it's not just a marginal, factor. Lots of workplaces have gone through, again, a decade's worth of thinking about how they want to deal with remote, work. Suddenly, in just a couple of months, right? Some of it's worked out better than others. but I think we'll see a lot of practices that people were doing because it was what they did yesterday, not just snapping back to where they were before. And that kind of productivity, of course, is essential to economic growth. But I do think there's going to be a question of what is the thing we're going to be doing with all those resources that we've freed up. You know, and again, I think some of that freeing up is actually very valuable, even though there's lots of dislocation associated with it. But we're going to have to figure out what to do with that. And given that these productivity enhancements are happening so fast, the normal processes of new things coming in as old things get destroyed is not exactly in alignment, right? The usual ways we deal with creative destruction are in a kind of temporal disalignment, and we're going to have to figure out some way, probably artificially, to speed up those new things that are going to come in to soak up the resources freed by various dislocations, both public and private.
All right. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have about 5 questions to get through. And this next question, I think Steve will be well equipped to answer. The US administration seems to be demanding reciprocity with respect to every single action on trade. What's driving this process, or what's driving these policies, and is there a way out? I think you wrote a book about this.
Well, not really on trade. And, you know, again, in general, you know, this administration had a pretty blunt force approach to trade. Again, not really distinguishing between allies and adversaries. And again, as I suggested before, despite the fact that I accept a lot of the intellectual argument for free trade, I do think that there's a specific issue with China that's just unavoidable. That we're in, you know, you simply can't be as intertwined with a geopolitical adversary, you know, and actually have that be effective. But the answer to that is actually more intensive trade with everybody else, right? And that's where the administration, by having just a general anti-free trade approach with everybody, is messing up the fact that actually we have a fairly pinpoint problem where China is concerned. And so part of this is simply that this is not an administration that's particularly good at doing anything. And so it's not a surprise that the same fact is true in trade. And I'd also say that, you know, isolating China would have, you know, really effectively is going to require cooperation for lots of our allies. And that's the kind of thing that's very hard to do while you're also beating up on them where trade is concerned. So I think that most of these attempts at reciprocity and everything are simply a mechanism to try to figure out whatever executive tools the administration has in order to reduce, at least be seen as being reducing trade for largely political reasons.
Thank you, Steve. Our next question. When the response of many countries to periods of uncertainty has been increasing protectionism, what options does India have to participate in global free markets?
Yeah, suppose I'll take that one. Yeah. Okay, so I've been actually arguing for some time, and this is, of course, even pre-pandemic, but I would not see any reason why the arguments change now. I've been making an argument that unilateral trade liberalization is also equally important for India. And this will work in multiple ways. One, I think we should get into, right now, let's say in the post-pandemic world, I think one, if you liberalize trade, let's say decrease your tariffs for, let's say a set of countries, maybe not China again, because that's a geopolitical question comes in, but by and large, if you universally reduce your effective average tariff rate from, let's say 13%, which is currently, to about 5 or 6%, you're signaling to the world that you are serious about trade, and that and that by itself is beneficial, as we've, I think, covered by now. It's beneficial to our producers, it's beneficial to our consumers, and of course it will help in our exports as well. Of course it will take time, and it's not as obvious as, and this goes into probably the next question as well, but it's not probably as obvious. But I think we should do that. Two, by liberalizing trade with countries, I think you will also create this need for reciprocity in the other country. So while you don't have to demand reciprocity, by taking an action such as this, the other country will see the benefits that are being accrued to you, and therefore will probably follow suit. So again, as we probably any other economist will do while we're talking about when we're talking about trade, I want to bring in this quote that just because the harbor of your exporting country is rocky, you don't want to retaliate by putting rocks on your own harbor, right? That's not what reciprocity means. You have an open trade policy, and by doing so, I think the other countries will also follow suit. And this has happened many times before. So, what are India's options now? I think one is to start getting into regional trade agreements. First, bilateral trade agreements, and then regional trade agreements. And therefore, by once we do one of these two steps, it probably becomes a lot more easier to have a uniform kind of small, liberalized trade regime. But you got to start small. Start with countries that it's beneficial to trade with. One, of course, would be the US. I think the US for now is showing friendly signs again. They've said we're going to reinstate the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences. Start with that. Give something back in return. For example, don't put tariffs or ban the dairy products. For example, all you need is a labeling requirement in order to beat around that. So there's a lot of give and take. And by doing so, if you have a good bilateral trade regime with, let's say, the US to begin with, that by itself will show a very strong intent, and it signals intent in terms of trade. So that's, I think, very seriously what India's options are.
Great, thank you. Our next question. It is often seen that free trade is the argument of economists, and opposition to free trade comes from politicians, while decisions are taken by short-sighted legislators. Why doesn't economic prosperity that comes through free trade play into winning elections, which is the only thing that spurs decisions in favor of deregulation? Excellent question.
Well, classically, the argument for this is that free trade, the benefits are usually not easy to trace, right? And so, again, this is the way political scientists think about this, is that in general, what politicians want is they want to do things that are visibly seen and are traceable by voters to things that they've done, right? So that they can actually show the mechanism, right? Where they can say, look, your town got this job because we built this bridge, right? I voted for it. You can see the bridge being built. Bob got a job. There's the traceability chain, as Doug Arnold referred to it. Whereas trade, the benefits of it are like marbled all the way through the stake of the economy, right? They're hard to trace to what anybody did. Now, in general, those things, economists, at least in the United States, have had power because they had institutional position, right? So in the United States, we have a Council of Economic Advisors that used to be run by economists. Now it's run by sideshow clowns. But lots of parts of the executive branch had economists who had actually gotten control, institutional control of those parts of the civil service. And given that lots of those of the questions around trade were sort of were not at the very highest level of visibility, that institutional position could make up for a lot of what was lacking in terms of voter understanding of the importance of trade. Again, the same issues apply, as I keep arguing, to internal protectionism as external protectionism, right? Lots of the benefits of deregulated markets happen in all kinds of ways that have 3 or 4 steps between that and the policy. And so it would be nice if you could find some way to educate voters and make them better understand the diffuse benefits of trade. But I think that there's very little behavioral evidence that you're going to successfully do that. And the better substitute is institutional power for the kinds of people who actually understand those arguments. At least that's what's worked in the past.
Yeah, just very quick addition to that. I mean, I was nodding violently in agreement to what she was saying. So this is the classic, concentrated benefits but distributed costs when you have, protectionist measures. And so that's one axis around which all of these things play out. And the other is the short and long run. So while protectionist policies can have immediate short run benefits to a few, which is visible, the long run kind of costs of protectionism will be a lot more, and then that will be distributed. So on the other hand, liberalization of trade will again have long run kind of benefits, but it might hurt you in the short run for a few of your producers who might go down and so on, and number of people losing jobs, and that can certainly become media headlines. Whereas increased choice for consumers is not really something that you can measure and trace, and then again put it up as a big Washington Post headline or whatever. So that's I think one of the really big difficulties in this particular aspect. So yeah, but I think just if I might add just one little thing, in this particular recent past of the trade war with US and China, we saw a very interesting trend that the Republican voters, or at least the Republican states, actually got the most hurt by some of the retaliatory policies by Mexico and China, especially the agricultural belt, right? So because Mexico put a retaliatory tariffs on, and China as well, on agricultural produce that was being exported from the US, they immediately saw that. But it's up to, I think, journalists, it's up to academicians, it's up to general media to highlight this connection between the two, saying that the trade war that was started has resulted in this loss of jobs and loss of income for this particular thing. And hopefully that connection can not just be made, but then can be sustained over a period of time and be reminded over and over again. Of course, that's an extremely difficult job. It's not easy, but I think that is what we should aim for again.
All right, we have about 3 minutes left and 2 questions. So we'll try to move through them quickly so that we don't miss anyone. Politicians worldwide will be able to, again, make the case for globalization to their voters only if the economic inequalities arising out of abusive corporate tax structures, poor redistribution, lack of social safety nets, etc., are addressed. What's your take on this? And I think this dovetails into what we were just talking about.
Anupam, do you want to go and take this one first?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think post-pandemic, it's going to be an even more difficult job for politicians to make a case for, for free trade. But I think politicians are extremely wily creatures. They're extremely smart. Both US politicians and Indian politicians have done a lot of things which would have seemed completely insane and have not only gotten away with it, but have in fact turned that into an election winning machine, from demonetization in India to promises of building a wall in the US. So there are crazy ideas and they've won with it. So if they're able to do that, I think if we can convince, so the task of policy analysts and the task of academicians and think tanks, etc., is to convince the politicians of the merit of the move and leave the politics to them. That's by and large what I would say. That's a very quick answer again.
Yeah, and the thing I would emphasize in that is that if you want to legitimate not just globalization, but again internal liberalization, that you really need to simultaneously both create social insurance systems to protect people from the dislocations associated with them and be visibly seen to be doing that. In the United States, I think that's both a child benefit is very important in that. Also, systems to protect local governments against big shifts in economic production. That's one thing the United States is very bad at, the fact that we have so much of our social insurance system is funded at the state level, right? Federal nationalizing Medicaid would go a long way to that. And having measures to more aggressively reduce the incentives to locate additional economic activity where it's already occurring, could be very good at sort of legitimating the larger market system in the United States. There's lots of artificial things that encourage additional, economic development in San Francisco and Boston and New York and places like that. So I think all those things are needed to legitimate that, and also to get rid of the ways that insiders benefit themselves. Also serves to, all those things serve to delegitimate a market system as well.
Well, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to make this very complex final question a lightning round, which isn't really fair to the person who's posed it, but we'll try to get to the meat of the question. So yes or no, will free markets be an answer to reducing poverty? Anupam.
Free markets can help economic growth, and every single 1% increase in economic growth brings about 3 million people, or 2 to 3 million people out of poverty in India. So yes.
Great. Steve?
Yes, if we're talking about free rather than rigged markets.
Wonderful. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your thoughtful discussion today. And thank you to all our attendees who joined us. And we are looking forward to continuing this partnership later this month with another briefing. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.